Hey everyone, this is Ben with the Tiger's Den, and I am out of town right now when Throne of Eldraine is dropping. In fact, I'm out of the country right now, so I figured that rather than do a usual stream or anything like that, I would just record something ahead of time, talk about some of the cards that I think are being underappreciated or maybe overhyped a little bit in Throne of Eldraine, and then maybe when I get back we can all look at this video together and laugh and see how very wrong I was. Nah, haha, look at how self-assured he is. But maybe not. And at the very least, hopefully it'll be interesting and fun. So, anyway, and actually, once I'm done, I was thinking maybe I would take a look at one of the decks that I'm thinking of brewing, because I love doing deck brewing, especially early in a format when everything is unsettled. And this is a really fun set to brew with. So, without further ado, let's take a look at some cards. So some of these cards are ones that I think are being undervalued, and some are cards that I think are being overestimated. And Robber of the Rich falls into the latter category. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that this card is really good. 2/2, a Breach Haste Bear in red. Cool. That is really cool. Probably gets in 2 damages when it comes down, threatens to do more damage later, kind of requires removal, all that stuff. But I think that when people are looking at this card, they're seeing it as a mono-red, hasty, 2-mana Thief of Sanity. Because, we all have PTSD about Thief of Sanity when it was running the meta and stuff like that. And people look at this and they say, wow, Thief of Sanity for 2 in red? Awesome. With haste? And I think that's a mistake. Because while it is kind of similar to Thief of Sanity, it's doing a similar thing, there are so many downsides attached to it that I think that it's just very enticing to think of it as the red Thief of Sanity, when really it's not. It does a similar thing, but, so first, opponent has to have more cards in their hand than you. That shouldn't be too hard because you're probably playing this in an aggressive red deck where you can empty your hand quickly. But maybe not. Maybe your opponent is also playing in an aggressive deck. Maybe your opponent mulliganed, and now this guy's just a 2/2 Reach Haste. And I mean, again, that's fine, but when we're evaluating the card as if this second ability is always, an always-on super relevant, let's put it into perspective here. On top of that, Thief of Sanity lets you look at the top 3 and exile one of them. Robber of the Rich, you just get 1 hit. So if that top card is a land, it's a complete miss. If that top card is like a circuitous route or something else that doesn't help your game plan at all, also a miss. I mean, circuitous route, I guess you can get some basic lands, but are you spending 4 mana to do that? Probably not as an aggressive red deck. On top of that, your opponent can see what you exiled. Thief of Sanity says face down. Robber of the Rich does not say face down, so it goes into the exile zone face up where everyone can see what it is. So you're never surprising your opponent with it. And on top of that, there's that last part about you can only cast the card on a turn that you attack with a rogue. So not only do you need to swing in with Robber of the Rich safely, have it survive, and then swing in again with it later and hopefully not have it die to cast the card you exiled, or with another rogue if you have other rogues, which granted is very possible. There are other good rogues in Standard right now. But that makes it a lot more conditional, because if you're just sacking your Robber of the Rich to cast the spell that you got with Robber of the Rich, that's not really a great proposition a lot of the time. And certainly you can do that. And there are turns where you'll play the Robber of the Rich, exile a good card, attack next turn, exile another good card, cast them both. Awesome. But that's the ceiling of the card, and I think that the floor is what's being misevaluated here. I'm not disputing how good it can be when it's really good. So anyway. I just think that this needs to be, I want to pump the brakes a little bit on Robber of the Rich, Really good card, but that last ability is not as good as I think people are estimating it to be. Because I've seen people saying like, oh, you're in red, well obviously throw in Robber of the Rich. It's like, but should you though? Like, you could, but you never stop to ask yourselves if you should. Anyway, that'll be all for Robber of the Rich. Let's move on to one that I think everyone agrees is pretty darn good, Castle Locthwain, and really all of the castles I feel like are great. I love cards like this that incentivize you to run more basic lands and that punish you for having really greedy mana bases. I mean, this can come in off of, the castles can come in off of shock lands too, but if you've got temples and stuff like that, or too many off-color lands that, don't have whatever the color is. Anyway, we all recognize how good that is, I think. The thing that I think people are misevaluating with this card is that people often, it feels like we often see card draw and we think control. So a lot of people look at Castle Locthwain and they say, oh well, this isn't great because as a control deck, you are going to have a lot of cards in your hand and you're not going to be able to spend all of these resources and then all of this life, lose 4 life to draw another card because you already have 3 cards in your hand. And that's all true, but I mean, one, control decks go hellbent too, end up with no cards in their hand. That does happen. But also, other decks than control like card draw. Aggressive decks like card draw. I mean, that's the thing that makes red deck wins so good right now, is that they have card draw. Really, really cheap card draw, and then Experimental Frenzy, which is just sustained. So it's not bad to have, oh, 2 of my creatures got killed and I don't have any more threats in hand. Well, let me draw another card and lose, like, 2 life. That's really good. That's really good, and I think that's actually where this card is the best, is in these aggressive decks that can empty their hand really quickly and then need to gas back up again to deliver the final blow or to recover after a board wipe or things like that. So I don't think anyone's saying this is a bad card, but I have heard people saying, like, you know, just the life loss is going to be too hard to deal with for these, you know, control decks. And yeah, it is going to be hard to deal with for the control decks, but it's going to be great in the less control-y decks. And even in control, it's still going to be very good, I think, because the opportunity cost is pretty low. So that's it for Castle Locthwain. Let's move on to Once Upon a Time. So I don't think anyone says that this card is bad. I think that we're all kind of on board with this is pretty cool in Standard, you know, obviously in things like Modern, Tron. Don't get me started on that. But Once Upon a Time in Standard, what I have heard some people say is, well, this card isn't as great as people say. It's not really that good. Like, it's good, but it's just kind of good. It's not really better than that, because it gums up your hand, and it makes it so that you need to cast this spell before, you know, if you have multiples, you have to, or draw it after turn 2. You know, now you need to spend that mana before you can actually get a castable card off of it, so it slows you down, it breaks your tempo, and all that stuff. None of that is incorrect, but I disagree that that makes it not good. For one, you don't have to run 4 copies. If it ends up becoming prohibitive, 3 or even 2 would really, really minimize the chance that you have these gumming up your hand when you don't want them there. But also, this is a standard format that we're going into where mana fixing is hard to come by. We have Fabled Passage, which is untapped once you have 4 or more lands. We have 4 dual lands that can come into play untapped in the shock lands. So any given color combination has exactly 4 untapped, potentially, lands. And that's about it. Everything else, I mean, the temples always come into play tapped, gain lands always come into play tapped. Once Upon a Time represents a way to, often for 0 mana, find that color that you're missing, even if you have to pay 2 for it sometimes. That's still a lot better than, well, I had to wait 5 turns before I found my second source of blue, and so now I'm dead. So I think that people are looking at the this really gums up your hand, it makes you less consistent part, but I think that that is missing the fact that it stops your hand from getting gummed up in the first place because it helps you find the lands that you need in a format where that is really hard to do. And on top of that, if you already have those lands, looking at the top 5 and just getting the most relevant creature is so good, especially because so many creatures are removal spells in Eldraine. Or, you know, tempo cards with, we'll talk about these guys later, but because of the adventures, this is a very, very flexible card in a way that I don't think a lot of people are really comprehending right now. So, again, no one I think is saying this card is really bad, but I think that it's being underestimated by a lot of people because I think that the gumming up your hand versus allowing you to actually play out your hand, that is not an even balance, and I think that some people are misevaluating that balance. Okay, so I'm going to go out on a limb with this one. Wildborn Preserver. So, green bear with flash and reach. Not playable. But it's not terrible, and it has this third ability. Again, with all these abilities on... There are a lot of abilities on Magic cards, man. I'm used to playing Heirloom Minotaur. But anyway, Wildborn Preserver. Whenever another non-human creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay X. When you do, put X +1/+1 counters on Wildborn Preserver. So, obviously, elephant in the room on this card, Flash. Flash is a really good deck. This is a card that go into Flash to replace things like Merfolk Trickster. Cool. Really easy to cast, too. 1 color weight is very relevant there. Because, you know, we've seen things like having to set up for an Essence capture, but then not being able to play your green card the next, you know, all that stuff. So, that's really good, but... And then, you know, you can flash in your Spectral Sailor end of turn, and then give this guy +3/+3 when you didn't have to cast your Frilled Mystic. All cool stuff. One thing that I think the reason this is being overlooked, though, is people are seeing Flash, and they're just thinking Flash deck. Flash.deck, this is where it goes. But I think that that's underselling the card, because, again, it feels like a lot of these decks have kind of a weakness in the 2-drop slot, and that's less true in green, because you have things like your Mana Dorks and stuff like that. Or, you know, Barkhide Troll. But this seems like it could be a real role player. I mean, for one, it's got the reach, which is good against things like flyers, which look really well positioned in the coming meta. It's got flash, so it can ambush Viper them while surviving, unless they have a Lord effect. But also, that last ability, I mean, in green, you've got Mana Dorks, and late-game Mana Dorks are rough to draw. They're effectively dead draws, but when you top deck a Paradise Druid, and then you cast it for 2 mana, and you spend your other 6 mana to make this guy an 8/8 all of a sudden, that is terrifying. And granted, that's like the ceiling of this card, right? Is you have all this mana sitting around, and Wildborn Preserver just goes, ooh, I'll use that. That's not going to happen all the time. Sometimes this is just going to be a 2/2 flash reach for 2, but even that as a floor, it's not terrible, I feel like. Again, flash being very good at pressuring opposing planeswalkers because you can ambush them and things like that. Unless they have a Teferi out. All these flash cards I'm talking about as if Teferi does not exist. Clearly he does exist, but, you know, that's part of the meta, and we're going to have to live with that for another year. Oh, joy. Anyway. But there's also these, you know, a lot of green decks are well-positioned to be using tokens, because you have things like the new Garruk making tokens. You have, not Oko, but, the Dreadhorde Invasion decks, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Which Oko can use to make a new token every turn. So in addition to your Mana Darks, then you have Tulsamir, like in the Wolf Tribal decks, and, you know, token makers are pretty easy to come by, and when you get a consistent stream of them, and you can just use this as a mana sink to make it bigger and bigger and give yourself a second axis of attack. Cool. I mean, like, sign me up. So anyway, this is probably where I'm putting myself on the most of a limb, but it seems good. It seems like it's worth more than the basically 0 attention anyone is paying to it right now. Maybe I'll come back and eat my words about that in a couple weeks or a couple months, but that's how I feel about it right now. So let's look at Order of Midnight. Speaking of 2-drops that I'm really putting myself out on a limb for. Also, by the way, I love this promo art. It is so cool. It kind of reminds me of, I mean, that's one of the great things about Seb McKinnon, right? Is that me as an old school Magic player, started in I think 1996 or something, 95. You know, looking at this and being like, I remember when Magic art was kind of metal, and Seb's art is often kind of metal, and I love it for that. But onto the card. So this is a weird card because, you know, there's your Murderous Rider, which is super playable because the murder end is really good. The creature end isn't great, but it's a really good upside for it. There's your Stompy Giant, Bone Crusher Giant, which the shock is pretty playable. A little overcosted, but pretty playable. And then as a 4/3 with an upside for 3, that's great having them together. You know, you're never sad to play either side. Whereas Order of Midnight sort of feels like neither side is good enough, right? Like, we've got Lightning Stormkin, 2/2 flying haste for 2, can block, unlike Order of Midnight, and it still doesn't see much play. However, and then, you know, returning a target creature from your graveyard to your hand. This is a 1-mana effect in black, and no one plays it. So, I mean, you've got Fine Finality, but that has an extra mode, and it gets you 2 things instead of just 1. But here's the thing with this card, is that both of these effects are things that I feel like are kind of needed, or not needed, but are very helpful in a lot of these kind of like mid-range or beat-down black decks. Because as I mentioned before, that 2-drop slot is kind of sparse. You're sort of stuck for really good plays there. And also they often lack a really grindy element. Order of Midnight gives you both of those things by, I mean, you can even do like, you know, turn 1, play your Knight of the Ebon Legion. Turn 2, your opponent shocks your Knight of the Ebon Legion. Turn 3, you get your Knight of the Ebon Legion back with Order of Midnight, and then cast your Knight of the Ebon Legion, and then you have Order of Midnight on the bench, ready to go in, pressure your opponent, kill a Planeswalker, things like that, when you spend 2 mana to cast it from exile. So there's that, but there's also, the deck kind of just wants a 2/2 that can threaten your opponent. Not being able to block, of course, is a huge deal because you can't use it to stabilize against aggressive decks. But just, you know, put down a 2/2 flying, and now suddenly in conjunction with your 1-drop, their Teferi will die if it bounces a thing. You know, their Narset will minus once and then never minus again. Their, you know, their life total is under pressure now, and you have your turn 1 Knight of the Ebon Legion or Gutter Bones also putting the pressure onto them, on top of, you know, being able to remove a threat on turn 3 with your, you know, your Stompy Giant or your Murderous Rider or things like that. So, and, I mean, late in the game it's even better, too, because you can, you know, once you get up to higher mana, you know, rebuy Rotting Regisaur, play Order of Midnight, stuff like that. And it gives these decks a grindy element that they kind of have a hard time with otherwise. You can actually, especially with, you know, if your adventure cards die and then you rebuy them and you're rebuying your 2-for-1s, which granted, you can't do that with Murderous Rider because if it dies, it goes underneath your library, and this is probably part of the reason for that. Those value chains just being too good. But, so even though I don't think this card, like, this isn't a card that I ever feel like, oh, I'm happy to throw this into my new brew. You know, great. Order of Midnight, sign me up. But I often look at it and I say, what does this deck need? I have 3 slots left, I have 2 slots left. What does this deck need? And I often say, it needs a couple more 2-drop creatures, hopefully with evasion, and it needs some way to buy back into a game where it's being outground. And Order of Midnight does both of those things, and I think that actually means that, at least until we get some more cards into Standard, that it might actually have a decent place in those decks. Let's actually go over to this one next, even though it's out of order. On that note, 2-drop creatures, Stormfist Crusader. Wow. I was saying, as spoilers were coming out, I was posting online, I just wish that my black-red aggro decks had a higher value 2-drop that I could run, either in place of or alongside Dreadhorde Butcher. And we got one. We got Stormfist Crusader. And half of the Magic community went, wow, awesome! And half the Magic community went, wow, that is unplayable garbage. Like, F-tier limited fodder. Why is that? This is, like... This is probably, of all these cards, the most divisive one that I have seen. Just in terms of the range of reactions people have given to it. I personally am on the side that this is a good card, and I'm going to explain why. Todd Stevens, on his new card evaluation thread, or not thread, video, over the last weekend, posed a hypothetical question to chat, which was... Okay, sorry, let me back up. This card exists because of the last ability, the symmetrical card draw. As a 2/2 menace for 2 in 2 different colors, that's okay, but it's usually not going to be worth a slot, I feel like. So it all revolves around this last ability. And symmetrical card draw is so hard to evaluate. So what Todd Stevens did to try to bring it into perspective is he said, if you're an aggro deck going up against a slower deck, a control deck or a mid-range deck, do you feel like you have a better chance of winning if everyone starts with 5 cards or if everyone starts with 10 cards? And most of his chat answered 5 cards. And that blew my mind, because aggro decks survive and win by fielding a critical mass of creatures that their opponent can't, creatures and burn, that their opponent can't answer in time, putting them behind on tempo by double spelling repeatedly, and then getting them out of the game while their opponent still has 6 cards left in their hand, because you are just fielding your cards so much more quickly than your opponent can, and they can't keep up with you. So Stormfist Crusader lends itself to that, because, like I said, your opponent usually dies with all these cards in their hand if you're the aggro match. That's the ideal, and it doesn't always work out that way. But that is what you're aiming for, and that is what you are often able to do when things come together. That is how you win. So the idea that it's worse to draw these extra cards seems really foreign to me, because effectively what you're doing, when your opponent has much more expensive cards than you, which they should if they're mid-range or control and you are aggro, they should have much more expensive cards. What your opponent is getting is card selection. What you are getting is card advantage, because your opponent is not able to cast these extra cards that they're drawing. They're effectively just, like, rummaging through their deck, trying to find the right thing, whereas you're going, oh good, more spells that I can cast, like, this turn or next turn. And I can just overrun them. And they're going to be spending 3 mana to answer my 1 mana threats, and they will fall behind and they will die. And so I don't understand this idea of, like, I want, as the aggro deck, for everyone to have 5 cards, because I don't see how you can use those 5 cards, say it's like 2 lands and a removal spell and 2 creatures. How are you ever beating a control deck with those 2 creatures before they stabilize? You need to drop threat after threat and overrun them quickly. And to do that, you need to have extra cards, and you need to be deploying your cards. You need to be breaking the card symmetry because your cards are lower value by getting them out there faster and double spelling when your opponent can't keep up. And we are losing a lot of good instant speed 2 mana removal, like Cast Down being the biggest one in the coming stand. Of course, we get things like Stompy Giant. But anyway, that is all. A lot of words to say that I think this card is pretty dang good. And a part of it too, okay, well, Spectacle, obviously this card is great with Spectacle. It just triggers it for free every one of your turns. But also, being a 2/2 menace with that ability, this card is usually dealing your opponent 3 damage every turn. Because if you're an aggressive deck, your opponent has a really bad choice to make. Say you have, like, this card and a big 3-drop out, or a Knight of the Ebon Legion. Say it's Knight of the Ebon Legion and Stormfist Crusader, and you're representing a pump. Your opponent can either say, I will put one of, say they have, like, 2 creatures, they can put a creature in front of Knight of the Ebon Legion for it to die, and then Stormfist Crusader gets in. Or they can double block Stormfist Crusader. You're probably killing one of them if it has 2 or less toughness. They're spending both of their blockers. Now your Knight of the Ebon Legion gets in for free, deals 4 damage, and pumps itself. So the menace is actually surprisingly good on this, and means that it's usually representing 3 damage per turn, and that is not inconsequential as an aggressive deck. So the life loss associated with the card gain is with the card draw is, I think, a lot better than people are giving it credit for. Because it's just, this is pretty much 3 damage, 3 damage, 3 damage. How many turns of that can your opponent survive when you are an aggressive deck that's drawing all these extra cards to put them to 0 as quickly as possible? So, anyway, and this could all turn out to be completely wrong. There are ways that this card gets really punished. One of them is you draw your opponent into a board wipe, and then they can, for 4 mana, usually blow up many of your cards, which probably cost you more than 4 mana to deploy all of them, and then you're in a really bad spot. So that is one place where you get punished. However, if this card isn't the thing that drew them into that board wipe, that is a moot point. So not every time you play this and they board wipe you, you're getting board wiped because of the Crusader, although it can also draw them into the lands to cast the board wipe. So there's things like that too you have to consider. Also, Narset obviously makes this card absolutely miserable, and that may in fact be a reason not to play this card. Like, that might push this card into not being playable, because Narset is prevalent and she is main deckable in lots of decks. If you run blue and you run non-creatures, might as well throw in some Narsets most of the time. Not always, of course, flash or whatever, but mid-range, slower, combo, control, stuff like that. Narset's just kind of a free include, and she makes this card so miserable. And we're just going to have to deal with that if we're going to play this card. You don't always have to cast the cards that are in your hand, and hopefully you can kill the Narset. So there's that. And there's also this card, if you're actually on the defensive in the match, this is also pretty rough there. So obviously there are times when this card is really bad, and that might be enough to say, nope, this isn't main deckable. But for what it does, I think that, when your opponent doesn't have a Narset, things like that, it's actually pretty great. And it's just a 2-drop. It's just a 2-drop. If they remove this card, they probably spent 2 mana to do it, and you haven't really fallen behind. So anyway, that's enough for this one. That was a lot of words. Let's talk about... actually, let's go into the Royal Scions next. Let's do that. So the Royal Scions. I talked about these in my... I talked about this card in my Planeswalker video a couple weeks ago. So if you want more in-depth on them, check that out. But for now, I'm just going to say that this card has pretty much been doing what I was hoping it would do, at least as people are brewing and testing on Cockatrice and other platforms. It seems like just the... oh, and of course we have the drawing 2 cards a turn matters now, which this facilitates really well. So that's been really cool to see, blue-red get some, get in there and beat down things being built around with it. The, first strike trample +2/+0 being really relevant when you are at all pressuring your opponent. And the thing that has actually surprised me about it in testing on Cockatrice has just been the -8 and how consistent, like how easy it is to get that off. I've been running them in decks that sometimes have Chandra Acolyte of Flame, at least out of the sideboard, and being able to like Chandra and then Royal Scions, and then the turn after that you can ultimate the Royal Scions is really good, because of course Chandra can put a loyalty on each red planeswalker you control, which includes the Royal Scions. So that's just been really cool. I have been having a lot of fun with this card. The ultimate has been going off repeatedly and usually winning the game, and it's just been really fun, and I hope that we end up seeing shells that support this card. because I like value, I like decks that have both value and aggression, and I like drawing 4 cards and shooting things for lots of damage. So speaking of shooting things for lots of damage, Ember Cleave. This is a card that I don't think people are saying is bad. I just don't hear anyone talking about this card, and I don't get it. Because, so as those who have been following this channel for a while know, I have an unhealthy fixation on making modern Death Shadow decks in Standard. And Ember Cleave gives us another one of those pieces because Death Shadow likes to run Temur Battle Rage a lot of the time, and Temur Battle Rage pumps your creature, gives it double strike and trample, and lets you win out of nowhere. We're like, okay, your opponent thinks they're okay because they're at 16 and I'm attacking them with my creature and they're going to chump block, and oh, oops, you just took like 19 damage. Let's go to game 2. And Ember Cleave lets you do that now, and granted, this is harder to pull off because you need to have the attacking creatures or spend 6 mana, which is really hard, but in aggressive decks, I've found that I'm usually casting this for 3, and that's only one more than Temur Battle Rage. Granted, it's double red, which that has been the difficulty, because a lot of these decks have had red as more of a splash. And I think that also, I should back up and say that I think a lot of people are looking at this as like, oh, this is a Knight card. This is a Knight's Tribal card. But apart from a few of the Knights synergizing with equipment, I don't think that's true at all. I think that this is any deck that is moderately aggressive and has creatures that they want to give double strike to. Like, that it's... I mean, that sounds probably, like, reductive and unhelpful, but it's pretty... I mean, even just putting this on Bone Crusher Giant, and suddenly your 4/3 is a 5/4 that hits them for 10 out of nowhere. And that is nuts. And one of the things that's been hard for these kinds of the decks that I like to brew, which is more in the like beat down mid-range, you know, some pressure, some disruption side, is that Field of the Dead just stomps you. And I won't say that Ember Cleave has turned that matchup around, but I will say that it has made it a lot better. It's not favored, I would say, from, you know, the little testing that I've done, but it's seemed pretty solid in those games because their plan is usually get into the late game by just plopping down all these chump blockers that can wall whatever you're putting down. You know, some of them have reach, stuff like that. So just being able to say, oh, well, that's a cute zombie, but I just trampled over it with a 16, you know, an 8-powered double strike trampler on my Rotting Registrar, and you're dead. Like, you just lost out of nowhere. It's like the fair, or the aggressive deck now has the same, oops, I just won because I found my 4th Field of the Dead and every turn I'm getting like 8 zombies now. They have that same, oops, I just won button. Oops, I win button in Ember Cleave. So this is legendary, so you don't want to run a whole bunch. I've been running it as a 1/1 split because even against pretty much any deck, it can be very good just to, you know, make your Registrar, your Knight of the Ebon Legion, your Skullcracker or Bone Crusher Giant, all those things, make them way bigger and win out of nowhere, or at least make your opponent's blocks very difficult. Of course, this is weaker after it's been played because then they know to play around it, but even in those cases, I mean, what do you do against the 5/4 double strike trampler? You know? It's very... I mean, I guess the answer is you put Cavalier of Thorns in front of it. But other than that, what do you do? So anyway, been trying it as a 1/1 split. It seemed really good. Might be right to just have one like in the sideboard or something. But it's been really solid and no one's really talking about it, so get to it. Get to it. Run Ember Cleave, run over zombies, profit. Oh, throw down a Questing Beast and can't even get blocked by zombies. That's just 10 damage right there. Running over people. Wrinkle, Master of Pranks, loves to run over people because he has flying and haste, and it's very hard to block because of that. This is a card that I was really torn on. Like, it seemed like this could be great or it could be garbage. Not it could be garbage, but it seemed like it might just not be good enough at 4 mana. And then I realized how good Flying Haste is. And granted, you get really sad when your opponent has Cavalier of Thorns. Like, you get really sad when your opponent has Cavalier of Thorns. But it's Flying Haste, so it can usually connect. And if it doesn't connect, I mean, pretty much most creatures are just sad when your opponent has huge creatures coming out, you know, Hydrate Krasis and stuff like that, you know, 8/8 flyers. Everything gets sad in that case, so Wrinkle isn't really different in that way, other than that he costs 4, so your opponent has more time to get those cards out. But in the cases where those are tapped down, or they don't have them, Wrinkle has been pretty dang good. Obviously, there's the Flying Haste element of just kill a Planeswalker. Put him down, kill a Planeswalker, and then the rest is gravy because you killed their Planeswalker. Good for you. But all of his modes are great in the right situations. I mean, the worst that I've seen is you don't use any of them, obviously. But even in situations where it's like your opponent has a creature and you have just Wrinkle, and you use Wrinkle to deal 3 and then blow up the board, and like reset the board. Even that is not bad, and since you can actually choose when to do it, even better. So, and your opponent can't blow you out by like, you have a token and you choose your modes, and then after you choose the modes, they kill your token, so you have to sacrifice Wrinkle, because once the ability goes off, there's not another chance for your opponent to respond before you choose what triggers go off. I'm pretty sure that's the case. So they can't do things like that where you get blown out. Anyway, the fact that you're often going Hellbent in these decks and things like Rotting Regisaur helps you to go Hellbent where you have no cards in your hand, so the discard becomes very easy to just throw it out there. Like, yeah, I have no cards in hand, just get rid of a card. I'm just Liliana of the Veiling you every turn. Lose 1 life, draw a card. Again, because you're probably on the aggressive side, you are probably more likely to be able to get your cards out faster than your opponent, so they're getting more selection, you're getting card... Well, you're both getting card advantage, but you're getting cards that you can cast immediately. Your opponent is probably more likely to be getting cards that they have to wait to cast until later because they already have cards that they want to cast. And then the life loss, too, so you're hitting them for 4, effectively. So, and then, you know, run this with Legion Warboss, sacrifice your tokens. Run it with Garruk, sacrifice the Garruk token, make your opponent blow up a guy, give Garruk a loyalty so he can ultimate next turn. Really strong plays like that. You know, blow up your Dreadhorde Invasion token, whatever. Blow up your Gilded Goose. So, Wrinkle, really cool. I love his art, too. It's just, like, it's really evocative art. So, it's been a lot of fun. I think that we'll be getting pranked repeatedly in the upcoming Standard, but probably not going to be, like, a, you know, everywhere card. I just wanted to bring up Wrinkle because it's another one that people don't seem to be taking as much notice of in the face of things like Questing Beast. And, you know, cards like Questing Beast and, you know, Oko, I feel like, and that sort of stuff, it's like, we all just agree that they're really good, I think, at this point. I don't feel like I have to talk about them, so I would rather talk about this stuff that I feel like is more fringy, kind of being misevaluated in my opinion, you know, stuff like that. So, Clackbridge Troll, second to last one here. 8/8 Trample Haste for 5. Wow, that's great. Basically, Desecration Demon ability, but your opponent gets things to sacrifice. Well, that's not so great. But, so I tend to be kind of gun-shy around Desecration Demon-like cards where, you know, it's an undercosted beater, but then there are ways that your opponent can turn it off and make you not be able to attack with it. So there's that. But this guy, the life gain and the card draw make it really solid. And one thing to remember with this card is that if you're using it to stabilize, you can actually use it to block the turn after it comes down. You just have to play it post-combat, and then your opponent doesn't have a window to tap it before the next combat. So if you just need to get something down there to block, you have your 5/5/8, you have your 5 mana 8/8 that you can block with for a turn before they start giving you life and stuff like that. Also, if you have Legion's End, of course, you can Clackbridge Troll and then Legion's End your opponent's goats away and turn off the free sacrifice. But even then, you know, this thing gains you 9 life over the course of a couple turns and draws you 3 cards, and then it's an 8/8 trample. They can still sacrifice their other cards, of course, but... So, if there is a mid-range beatdown black heavy deck, this is probably going to feature in it, I would imagine. Again, it's hard to evaluate these things where you're giving your opponent the choice of what to do, and where you're giving them resources, even if the resources aren't super relevant because your guy has trample and stuff. But it's just so undercosted for what it does, and they gave it that upside that it feels like it would be... I'd be surprised if we didn't see it anywhere. And then finally, we've got Brazen Bar over here. And this is probably the other one that I see the most hemming and hawing over in terms of like, it's great, no it's not, it's garbage, it's great, it's garbage. And I think that the reason for that is that tempo advantage is something that is very hard for a lot of people to like... It's hard to wrap your mind around tempo advantage. If you play 3 creatures and your opponent board wipes them, it's very easy to see, wow, they spent 4 mana and 1 card to kill like 5 mana worth of 3 cards for me. They're way ahead now. But if I play like a 6-drop creature or something like that, like, you know, say I play Clackbridge Troll, bad example because of the end of the battlefield ability, but if I play a big creature like that or a big enchantment or something and my opponent bounces it for 2, it's harder, I feel like it's harder to emotionally internalize that exchange because mana advantage just doesn't really immediately jump out the way that card advantage and like killing multiple things for 1 card does. So I think that this is being underestimated because of that. Because obviously Petty Theft would not be playable as a card. And I don't think that Brazen Bar itself would be playable without the adventure effect. But when you have opponents who... I mean, there are some big, like, hefty monocost cards out there that are getting played. And not all of them do things immediately when they hit the battlefield. A lot of them do, for sure, but not all of them. And being able to do such a huge tempo swing with Petty Theft... I mean, even if you're just bouncing a 3-drop, you're coming out ahead. And then you have a 3-drop you can conveniently play and, like, blow up a Narset after that. You know, blow up a Planeswalker, threaten your opponent's life total. And also, again, a 3/1 evasive flash creature. That is premium, not just for the flash deck. I think people see flash and they think, okay, it goes in Simic Flash, but that is good in a lot of places, especially when there's lots of Planeswalkers and lots of big creatures gumming up the ground. Going over the top of them is really good. Obviously not being able to block is a huge issue, but having I can bounce the thing to give myself a tempo advantage and then get rid of the card disadvantage that's usually associated with those bouncing a permanent plays by fielding a creature that can pressure your opponent. That is great. So I think this is being underevaluated because of that. And yeah, I expect to see this not only in Flash, not everywhere, but not just in Flash either. So could be totally wrong again about any of these, but I'm going to put a cut in here and then start up again because the helpful sprite that walks behind me sometimes should be getting home soon, and then the dog will be barking. So I don't want that in the video, but so I'll put a cut in here, and then we're going to talk about the couple decks that I'm looking at brewing. So stay tuned for that.